Welcome to the Northern Renaissance, our final stop in our exploration of the Renaissance throughout Europe. Now, the Northern Renaissance used to really be called more commonly the Reformation, and that is still a term used for one specific piece of what was happening during this period. However, I prefer the term Northern Renaissance because it really captures the art, the literature, and the other Renaissance-esque aspects of society that was happening in this place, only now no longer in Italy. We are moving to Northern Europe. The other name I could have called this Renaissance is the Forgotten Renaissance, because when the typical student closes his eyes and imagines the Renaissance, he does not think of the works I'm about to show you. Instead, he always thinks about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and the famous pieces that we've been studying ourselves for the last 2 weeks. And there is a good reason for that. That is where the original Renaissance started, or the traditional Renaissance, as it's often called. It started in Italy. It started with guys like Giotto and Cimabue. It started in Florence with Lorenzo de' Medici. But just like everything else, the ideas started to transfer. And as time continued, they started moving north. And it's when they actually got into Germany, into northern France, and into England that the quote-unquote Northern Renaissance took place. Now, you're going to see the Northern Renaissance is quite different than the Italian Renaissance in many ways. The first, most obvious difference that you're going to run to is the fact that the Northern Renaissance focused on religion. Now, we made a big deal about the fact that, religion was still very important in Italy, and guys like Michelangelo were still devout Catholics at the same time they were doing their amazing work. But you can't help but notice that we were starting to move away from religious domination of the field. This isn't the Middle Ages anymore. The church's power was starting to decline. And it's because of that, because of the decline in the Catholic Church, that the Northerners wanted to basically change their society, to take advantage of the Catholic Church's weakness to reshape religion the way they thought it should be. And what is actually born as a result of this is another type of humanism known as Christian humanism. Now, this is exactly the same idea of humanism we were talking about last week, that humanism is the focus on the individual, the elevation of the individual so that he can find his own earthly fulfillment here and not just wait for, paradise to be happy. The difference is that the Christian humanists were looking at the same idea, but were focused on early Christian manuscripts as opposed to necessarily the early manuscripts of Aristotle or Plato. So the same idea, just a different focus in what basically they're considering. To truly understand how sweeping the changes are that are about to take place, you really need to have a good idea of what religion was like in the North, because frankly, it was quite different than what we've been talking about in Italy and in other places closer to the Catholic hub of power in Rome. If there's one word that I would use to describe what the North was like, it would be ascetic. Now, that sounds like a hard word, but basically all ascetic means is self-denial. This was a tradition that was focused on being a lot more prim, a lot more proper, a lot more self-contained. Don't run around being showy. Don't try to make sure everyone's watching you as you devote your life to Christ. Just devote your life to Christ and get on with it. That was basically the attitude. And when you think about, all those gorgeous Gothic cathedrals that we were talking about, the Notre Dame, Chartres, the fantastic flying buttresses and stained glass windows and so forth. If you notice, the majority of those did not tend to be in England and Germany. They tended to be in France, especially southern France. They tended to be in Italy. They tended to be in Spain, so forth. Now, I'm in no way claiming that, northern countries did not have Gothic cathedrals, because they certainly did. But the people tended to look at those as like, wow, we are trying so hard to be showy here. We're trying so hard to look grand and massive and important. And they felt as if the church was losing sight of what its true mission is, to bring people to Christ and to make sure they're living the godly life that Christ wanted them to live. Now, there are two basic events, more or less, that demonstrate basically how expansive this attitude was in the North. The first one was actually a movement known as Devotio Moderna. Now, that just means modern devotion. And it started in the Netherlands, which of course is in Northern Europe, and it was focused on piety and anti-clericalism. Now, piety is just another fancy-dancy word for devotion. So be honest, be a good Christian, focus on the way Jesus wants you to live. Anti-clericalism basically means anti-priest. Now, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. That in no way means anti-Christian. The people in the North were extremely devout and extremely Christian, but they didn't like the idea of having to go through a priest and or a pope as an intermediary to God. Why can't we just talk to God ourselves? Why can't we just pray to Jesus ourselves? They didn't like that, and they didn't like a lot of the abuses that the Catholic Church was starting to engage in that we've been talking about for a little while, especially that sense of Gothic dualism, that there was a lot of corruption with the church at the same time that they were preaching, oh, don't be corrupt, be good Christians. The other item that basically demonstrates the depth of belief or the Northern people was a book known as Imitatio Christi. That just means imitation of Christ. And to understand this book, first of all, you have to realize how massive it is. Other than the Bible, Imitatio Christi was the most published book in all of history up until the 20th century. Think about that. Think about what that means. That literally for the, say, 600 years leading up to the 20th century, that we were publishing books, that Imitatio Christi was number 2 behind only the Bible for all that time. That's a pretty massive statement. And essentially what this book was more or less what we consider now a devotional. Every single day, what do I need to do to bring Christ into my life and actually live the Christian lifestyle that he wants us to do? So these ideas altogether basically show you that we are dealing with people who take Christianity very seriously, just like their Catholic counterparts, but who are much more, focused and simplistic in the way they want to do it, and extremely practical in the way they want to do it. This is essential because of one gentleman who, of course, lives in the North, is about to make some massive changes to the way Christianity runs, basically for the rest of time. And his name is Martin Luther. Now, whether you're Christian or not, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, you have to give Martin Luther an awful lot of credit because he single-handedly took on the Catholic Church in a time when the Catholic Church was still extremely powerful. And what you have to realize is that Martin Luther was in no way anti-Christian. He was actually a monk himself. So he was extremely devout, extremely focused on the Catholic Church. And he really did not set out to separate from the Catholic Church, even though ultimately that's what he does. He was a reformer. He looked at the excesses of what the Catholic Church was doing, and he basically just wanted to fix it. Okay, he loved the church. He loved, the Pope. He just didn't want it to go down the path that he looked and saw it was going down. And he basically thought all these excesses are against Jesus. This is not what Jesus wanted. He did not want his popes having babies and living in palaces and bilking all the money from the poor to spend on their own gluttony and so forth. And one of the practices he was most antagonistic to was something known as the sale of indulgences. What an indulgence was basically buying your way into heaven. That if you do something wrong, because everyone does, right? No big deal. Just slip the priest a 20. He'll say a few extra prayers for you. Next thing you know, you're forgiven, right? But that isn't where it stops. Indulgences also, you were able to purchase them to forgive future sins. So let's say, things aren't going well right now. I'm planning on having a little adultery next week. Okay, what do you say, Father? 50? Would a 50 cover it? And I could basically buy my way into heaven. Now, that concept in and of itself is bad. What was really bad was the way they targeted the poor. Keep in mind what the life expectancy was in this period. There was an awful lot of death, especially among children. And this, of course, isn't even during the plague anymore. This is just normal day-to-day life. When you look at the poor conditions and everything else, a lot of children just didn't make it to adulthood. And when a child would die, the priests in the area would go to the mother and say, well, your poor child was not able to live to see all the sacraments through. They couldn't go through communion. They couldn't be baptized sometimes and so forth. Your poor child is going to go to hell. But if you want to spend a little bit of money on this indulgence, you can buy your child's way into heaven. What's really sad is that families that were literally on the verge of starvation would save all the money they could to buy that indulgence for their child because they didn't want their child to spend eternity in hell just because they weren't able to spend $10 to buy them a pass into heaven. But the result of that, of course, was even more hardship and everything else for the family members still living, because they would be even that much closer to starvation because they had to give extra money to the church beyond just the standard tithe. And Martin Luther looked at this and just thought this was absolutely horrible. That how can the church be taking advantage of people like this on something that was so awful as far as what Jesus would have thought. And what Martin Luther did very famously was he wrote up a list that was known as the 95 Theses. And basically, it's a very straightforward list. It's like, okay, church, these are the 95 things we're doing that we're doing wrong. Let's fix it. And he took it, he went to the cathedral door in the city where he lived, and he nailed it to the wall. He nailed it right to the wall. And even though he meant it as a Reformation movement, like let's fix the church, the Pope was so incensed that anybody would take that attitude that he was immediately kicked out. You're no longer a monk, you're no longer a Christian, and so forth. And what became known as the Reformation began. This is when basically the northern countries of Europe split off from Italy, split off from the Pope, and said, well, if that's how you're going to be Pope, we're just not going to play ball with you anymore. We are going to be separate. We don't need you to talk to God. We can talk to God directly. Now, this new church basically was called Protestant, and you can see the term protest is hiding in the name. And the Protestant church of today is still the descendants basically of this original movement with Luther. Now, it was a challenge to the authority of the church, but I just need to make this really clear. It was not anti-Christian. The people were still fairly devout. This was not the period where people were looking to other religions or moving towards atheism or anything like that. They just didn't want to be Catholic anymore. They didn't want to be a part of those excesses that was happening in the Pope's church. But, as I'm sure you would guess, the Pope was not just going to sit back and lovingly let half of Europe leave. Because if half of Europe suddenly decides they're not Catholic, guess what they take with them? They take all their tithe money. That, of course, has been pouring into Rome for hundreds and hundreds of years now. And they take all their land. Remember, at the time of the Middle Ages, the church owned 1/3 of all the land in Europe. Well, half of that land was in the north, and all of a sudden, it didn't belong to Rome anymore. And so it literally became extremely violent. The Protestant Reformation was not this peaceful, splitting apart of ideas, and they just shook hands on it and separated. It was awful. There was murder in the streets. There was, monks being taken and just, murdered by Protestants that didn't agree with them anymore. And the two components of society were both equally active. The peasantry wanted to get rid of that yoke hold that the church had on them. So they were the ones that were kind of being very vicious and active in the fighting. However, the princes were all too happy to indulge their people's desire to get rid of the church, because if they were able to throw out the Church of Rome, guess who got to get the property back? The kings and queens and the princes throughout Northern Europe. So they were all too willing to go along with this Protestant Reformation. And basically, it just grew and grew over a period of about 200 years, where different Protestant groups started sprouting up, that we disagree with the Catholic Church, but we also disagree with that Protestant group over there. And that is why we have the plethora of churches that we have today. There, when you consider there's Baptists, there's Episcopalian, there's Methodist, and so forth. All those are different Protestant groups that have just little disagreements with each other and a fairly big disagreement with the Catholic Church. but they all were fighting against each other in this period and looking for independence from each other. At the end of it all, the fighting that took place for nearly 200 years was, on one scale, Catholics versus Protestants, and in this case, North versus South, because the countries closest to Rome were the ones that tended to stay Catholic, all right? However, it was also Protestant versus Protestant. So literally there would be groups in Germany fighting each other, and then there would be a Protestant group in England fighting a Protestant group in Germany or in northern France and so forth. So it was a pretty bloody time period. But when all the dust was settled and everything was done, what we found was that there was a Christian church now that was splintered in a way it hadn't been splintered before. The age of faith and the universal admiration that everyone held for the Catholic Church doesn't really exist anymore. Half of Europe is Catholic. The other half of Europe is broken down into numerous different Protestant sects, all vying for basically a place in society now that there was a little bit of a vacuum left from the Catholic Church. Now, the result of this, of course, is that society is going to change. You can't lose your central focus of power here that has basically dominated society since the fall of Rome for 1,000 years and not see shifts and not see changes. And that, of course, is what the Northern Renaissance was all about. That's why, frankly, I think Northern Renaissance is a better name than Reformation. The Reformation is too narrow. That's just focused on the fact that we're not all Catholic anymore, even though we're still all Christian. So the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, looks at the literature, the art, and so forth of this period. And when you think Northern Renaissance and you think England, the one thing you should think is literature, okay? That, for whatever reason, tends to be England's contribution throughout most time periods. England's just not famous for its art a lot of times, but extremely famous for its contributions in literary circles. And that is definitely the case here. The Northern Renaissance is the time of Shakespeare. Now, what we see is that literature in this period had that humanism aspect. So we are getting influenced by the Italian Renaissance, but it combines that with a religious fervor, and it basically kind of starts contradicting what was going on between the medieval period and the modern period. Like, this was their growing pains basically into the modern era. And the result was a literature that tended to be very satirical, mocking of society, joking. How can we make things better? Let's, make jokes about it and see if we can figure it out. The three most famous writers, all English, during this period in the North were Erasmus, Thomas More, and Shakespeare. And of course, Shakespeare is the one that is most important. So for whatever reason, England equals literature. That should always be in your mind. But that does not mean that there was not some serious art going on as well in the North. Now, just like in Italy, art expands for the first time, since probably ancient Rome, because we had art in the medieval period, but it certainly wasn't as expansive as what we see now. And that happens too. And even though they do somewhat explore secular themes, religion is still, by all accounts, the most important topic. And that makes sense. They're the ones in the middle of this massive shift in religious thought. Now, when we go through the art of the North, you're going to see something very clearly. We're not in Italy, okay? We do not get sensual nudes. We do not get beautiful, rich colors and everything else. What they focused on instead was detail, and the sense of the portraits they do are very, very different. One of the best examples of Northern Renaissance art is a Dutch painter named Van Eyck. And you see the painting right there in front of you. That's one of his most famous paintings. This is actually a marriage scene. I always joke, it looks like a shotgun wedding of sorts there, but nonetheless, this was kind of the traditional marriage. And when you look at the details of the individuals there, you can see what I mean when I say we don't have sensuality here. We have very flat, accurate, detailed depictions of people that give us backgrounds, that give us accuracy and realism, but they don't give us passion and emotion the same way the Italian Renaissance masters did. And this is a lovely picture because it's very symbolic. They're holding hands, which is the only time like a man and woman would be able to touch in public in this period, is if they're married to each other. So this is, the wedding ceremony where they're grasping hands. The little doggy on the ground in front of them was representative of fidelity, of faithfulness. So they're there. The fact that they're actually in a bedroom with the bed shown there is that they're basically wishing for plenty. And in fact, if you look to the left, there's oranges on the shelf right there. Oranges were a symbol of fertility. So they were hoping that this would be a fruitful union. And in the very back, the circle in the very back is actually a mirror. If you look really closely, you can actually see the artist himself standing there. He painted himself in a little bit of a self-portrait. But this became a beautiful example of what was happening in the Northern Renaissance. Characteristics of the Italian Renaissance as far as background and realism and perspective and so forth, but lacking in the depth of motion and feeling that we see in Italy. This is another one of Van Eyck's really famous pieces, Man in a Red Turban. Some people say it's a self-portrait, other people say no, but nonetheless, whether it is or not, you see the beautiful detail and accuracy that they cared about, much more so than the depth and love and everything else that comes in other areas. This is the final piece we're going to look at. This was actually an altarpiece that Van Eyck did. And you can see that it, has a lot of the aspects really of medievalism, frankly. It has, the beautiful details, a lot of the bright reds and blues and golds that we see. The main reason I show this to you is because I want you to look at the way the nude is represented in the North. Because all the way to the left, we have Adam. All the way to the right, we have Eve. And they are standing there in their nude glory. But it's not in any way the same depiction of rich sensuality that we get with our nudes that we saw, like with Michelangelo or Titian. That they're almost like a sickly color, very calm, very focused. And when you look especially at the bottom half of the altarpiece, all of the, fine detail, the leaves, the plants, the backgrounds, everything else. I mean, it's beautiful and it's marvelous, but it's just different than what we would have seen elsewhere. Another really popular Northern Renaissance painter was a man named Hieronymus Bosch. And you see before you his most famous piece. That's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, this is known as a triptych, which basically is just a fancy-dancy term for a three-part painting that was designed to be hung together. Okay, so the piece to the left is actually the Garden of Eden. We see God in the middle with Adam and Eve. Tons and tons of detail, and actually interesting detail. If you look through there, you can kind of judge for yourself some of the strange choices that Bosch, added to there. The centerpiece are basically tons and tons of people and animals and so forth engaged in all aspects of erotic delight. Okay, this is basically meant to show that once we left the Garden of Eden and we turned to earthly delights, how awful mankind came as a result. That we just wanted to basically please and pleasure ourselves and not focus on the important things. The result of that is the piece to the right, which is basically the Armageddon, the end of mankind, where basically we're going to get our just desserts for what we've done. Now, the overall example here, this is a beautiful example of Bosch's work. I tend to joke that I feel like it's a Where's Waldo piece because it's so busy and there's so many things going on that you have to really focus in on the detail to understand, the overall piece. But the thing to take away again is that it's a beautiful example of the Northern Renaissance. Fine detail, not sensual, extremely religious in the sense that we're going to bring hell and damnation down upon us because of our behavior, which was not the message of Italian Renaissance pieces, even when they were religious. Think about Michelangelo celebrating, man's creation and the beauty that God has created on earth, not looking at it as kind of a condemnatory attitude of this is going to bring us to the gates of hell if we're not careful. Now, this is another piece by Bosch, and again, just to show you that this is very typical of him, this piece is extremely dark, and again, it's a continuation of Judgment Day, that this is what's going to happen to us as a result of our actions. And do yourself a favor and pull up this piece on Google and zoom in and look at some of the detail of exactly what's happening to the people that are left on Earth after, the hell that is broken loose starts taking place. It's pretty fascinating. The last artist that I want us to consider was a gentleman by the name of Albrecht Dürer. He was German. And he is most famous for his woodcuts, which is why this is black and white. Now, he did do some painting, but I wanted also to show you that Renaissance ideal of exploring alternate styles was definitely alive and well in the North. And so we get Albrecht Dürer doing his woodcuts, and again, tending to focus on Christian ideas. Now, we see here before us an angel who is leaning down on his shoulder, and just staring forward. And the word we see in the back is melancholia. Melancholy is just another word for, it's not full-blown depression, but it's sadness. It's a sense of forlorning. And here we have this angel who by all accounts should be glorious and happy, staring off that things just aren't quite right. And that's just a wonderful depiction of basically the sense that the Reformation was ripping Europe apart in a way. However, Dürer also is responsible for the piece you see before you, which is, of course, Jesus' hands in prayer. Oftentimes, this has been a very famous pose. You see it a lot in woodcuts and in, old-fashioned living rooms and so forth, coming from Dürer. So still extremely religious and still focused, but a slightly different take than, of course, what you would see in Italy. And finally, this is another one of Dürer's most famous pieces. This is a knight basically returning from the Crusades. And you see at the very bottom the S1513, that's 1513 is when he made this piece. And underneath there is Dürer's very distinctive signature. That's how he always signed it. That's a big A with a little D inside. But this woodcut is a glorious example of his extreme focus on detail and is essentially the hell and damnation that we as people are carrying around with us. And so at the end of it all, the basic most important thing to take away about the Italian Renaissance versus the Northern Renaissance is that the same ideas motivated both. They were both focused on background and realism and detail and beauty and everything else. The Italians, though, took it to sensuality, to enjoyment, to beauty for beauty's sake, whereas the Northern artists instead turned to Christianity, to hell and damnation, to the religious themes that, of course, would be foremost in their mind because they were literally the battleground for the Reformation itself. And that completes our discussion of the Northern Renaissance.